Right, hello everyone. I'm John Courtneidge and it's January 2014, and for the last 20 odd years I've been talking about something called cooperative socialism as an alternative to capitalism and to either state communism or totalitarian fascism, both forms of totalitarianisms in other words. And I've been asking a group of people how we can make some progress on this. And my friend Greta Doucette in Moncton in New Brunswick in Canada has suggested that I should make a video, or at least say something about it. So here I am just trying to do that. Greta puts it quite simply. She says that she loves cooperative socialism because it's a combination of cooperation, which is the alternative to competition or fighting, and I don't like fighting either, and sociability, community, that sort of stuff, which is obviously the difference between community and selfishness, or loneliness, all of those terrible circumstances where you're just on your own, drowning. So for her, cooperative socialism is cooperative plus social. It's pretty straightforward and I like it a lot. So thanks, Greta. Now, for me, I just used that name cooperative socialism because it was pretty obvious to me that in my experience of trying to do political work, that there were two sorts of progressive people. There were the fixers, the people who got in there and sorted it all out and told everybody what to do. And those of us, and perhaps I'm a fixer and a bully as well, I don't know, there's a bit of this in all of us. The rest of us who would far rather we got on cooperatively and peacefully together and made progress. So why was I bothering to do this? Well, back in the day I realised that the world as we know it looks like that. More accurately, probably like that, if you live in a very unequal country like the United States. And the UK is pretty unequal, and so is Canada. And it occurred to me that when the people who'd read Karl Marx were talking, and they talked about the dictatorship of the proletariat, what was going to happen was this. Just an inversion. So these people on the top and these people on the bottom would swap places, and the people on the bottom were going to tell everybody what to do, and the people on the top were going to really lose out. Well, the last 100 years has shown us that that just doesn't work. Or more accurately, when you just turn a hierarchy upside down, you just end up with a new bunch of bosses. And so the people at the top in any society are as frightened as can be, and they will do anything, and I mean anything, to avoid that. So if that's the way the world looks at the moment, what does cooperative socialism look like? Well, just using my hands, or just one hand, I think that cooperative socialism looks like that. All of these digits are equal, they're all equally digits, but they're all different, they all do different things. A thumb isn't a little finger and a ring finger and so on and so forth. And in the past, where's this? In the past I've used this pack of pens to demonstrate that idea. So there's the world as we know it, and there's cooperative socialism, more equal. Now of course with this filming you can actually see the transparent packet that holds the whole thing together. And in a more equal society, even if you investigate what's inside the packet, and particularly if you're holding it the right way up, then nothing falls out. Of course, if you held it the other way up, it will fall out in one go. But of course, in a hierarchical society, if you look inside the packet and investigate what's in there and take things out, then normally everything just falls to bits on the floor. I'm not going to do that because then I want to use these pens, but I'm sure you get the idea. So, cooperative socialism is all to do with equality, economic equality, and about 2-3 years ago a very important book popped out, written by one of my friends, Richard Wilkinson, and his partner Kate Pickett. I know Kate pretty well, called The Spirit Level. And this book, as you can see from the cover, explains and gives the evidence, and it's evidence-based, not opinion-based, on why equality is better for everyone. And if you want to look at the evidence, just find the paperback edition with that blue star on it. Because when Penguin, there's the Penguin publisher's mark, published the hardback copy of this, it all sold out. They were very impressed. So they produced a paperback edition, and that all sold out. And a group of libertarian right-wingers apparently produced a book called The Spirit Level Myth to try and rubbish the evidence in this, The Spirit Level. And because Penguin had sold the paperback edition out, they asked Richard and Kate to write an extra chapter, and that's why this one has got a blue star on it, because it's got the rebuttal chapter in that to the Spirit Level Myth. Now, the evidence in the book then is that if you have a more income equal society, then everybody's better off, including the environment. So a society that looks like that is a lot better than a society that looks like this. But I still think we can go on from there to here, because the more equal societies, although they're doing better than, say, us in the UK or in Canada, places like Germany and Sweden, Finland, Japan, far better indicators of happiness and health and recycling and trust amongst neighbours and lack of bullying in schools and so on. Much better than the UK and the US and Canada. I still think we can go on better than that, because those societies are still based on a very deep income inequality and a very, very deep economic inequality. So first of all, the deep income inequality is that in those societies I've just mentioned, there are still people who own economic resources and who get income, unearned income, even when they are of working age, from the ownership of those resources and from the work that other people do. And if this sounds as though we're careening off into Karl Marx's books, I can tell you I've never read them, but the one thing I do know is that according to people who have read them, and there's a great RSA, Royal Society of Arts, video on YouTube by David Harvey about this. Karl Marx didn't seem to have come up with an alternative to capitalism, he just described it. And before Karl Marx was around, there was a 17th, 18th century Quaker man called John Bellers. This is a collection of his writings from the 1930s, and a more recent collection of his writings published, which you could probably find in bookshops or second hand. And John Bellers famously wrote that the labours of the poor are the minds of the rich. Not the minds of the rich, the minds. And in essence what John Bellers was saying was that the rich people steal the work, the wealth that the poor people create. Unfortunately, his solution was to set up colleges of industry where the poor unemployed people could work and the rich people would still get the proceeds from that. But anyway, that was of its time, and Karl Marx and Robert Owen, who's considered to be one of the earliest founders of the cooperative movement, both had read and understood what John Bellers was talking about and mentioned him. So well done to John Bellers. He happens to be a Quaker just like me. Obviously he's now passed away. Anyway, so back to this question of going from that, which is obviously better than this, to that. Well, it turns out that there are 5 economic mechanisms which create the income inequality that Richard and Kate talk about in the Spirit Level book. And the first of those I call theft. So again, using the 5 fingers on one hand, theft to me is the ownership, the owners call it, of economic resources. And back in the 17th and 18th century, it was pretty obvious to anybody who really thought about it that there was a small group of families who owned everything, all the economic resources of the country, and they then exploited or employed or even owned the rest of the population to convert those economic resources into money, and then they use that money to enforce power. And I'll talk about power in a bit. So for example, if you take a lovely book, Early Modern England, A Social History by Sharp, and then another follow-up book by Royal, which covers the following centuries. I think they were probably written as school books in the 60s, 70s, 80s, both extremely good. Anyway, they point out that about 1% or less of the population in Britain, in England and Wales in particular, had ownership of essentially the only economic resource around, and that was land. So the monarchy and the aristocracy, a couple of hundred families, owned everything, and everybody else had to work and give a significant proportion of that work's wealth to the aristocracy. And since I'm part of Occupy, we've had this slogan hung around our neck that we are the 99%, as though there's 1% of people who own everything, and we're the 99% who are worked for a living. We're part of the worked classes rather than the old-fashioned phrase, the working classes. Well, once again, I think that's too simple, and it's not really very, very helpful. First of all, we're all in this together, as David Cameron says. We're all connected, even if we're connected in a hierarchical way. We're all connected, all part of one body, as Jesus is reported to have said in the book, in some of the writings of the Apostle Paul, Corinthians. But in addition, it's not just that there's 1% of owners and 99% of the rest of us flogging it out. Because if you think back, say, to the analogy of a Roman or a Greek galley, the galley was probably being pushed along through the hard work of the slaves who were probably chained to the oars. The boat was probably owned by somebody who wasn't in the boat, but at the back of the boat was just a small number of people who got whips and the control of the rudder and the sail mechanisms and so on. And so, rather than just talking about the 99% that work and the 1% who own everything and take the fruits of that work in the form of rent, interest and profit, I'll talk about those in just a minute.
A vast virus database has been updated.
Aha! So you probably just caught that as well. Well, let's click that one off and carry on. That, as well as the 1% of people who own the economic resources, the aristocracy and the monarchy in the case of 18th century England, and the ship owner in the case of the Roman galley or slave ship, that there's a proportion of families who are in between the 1% and the rest of us, these families here. And I guesstimate, and that's all it is, that this comprises about 10% of families. Now, using class language, they might be called the middle class, but I don't think that's terribly helpful. Because nowadays, through all sorts of pension schemes and saving schemes and equity schemes and so on and so forth, members of the people who spend most of their life being worked for somebody else's benefit, own some of the economic resources, a tiny amount, and so you could say that they are part of the middle class. But my breakdown would be that there's 1 or 2% up here, let's call it 2 because that's the figure I used to use, and then 10% of families here that keep the rest of the 88% of us in control. And how do they use that? How do they achieve that control? Well, there seem to be 3 power mechanisms that are used to get people to do what another group of people want to do. And John Kenneth Galbraith in The Anatomy of Power describes these. I think they are the 3 things that Jesus was tempted with by the devil. And John Kenneth Galbraith uses fancier words. I'll tell you what they are, but my use for those words is bribery, bullying and brainwashing. I usually use them in the other order: bullying, bribery and brainwashing, or the stick, the carrot and your telly. And yeah, okay, you're watching this on a screen, but at least you've chosen it, and I'm not doing this for my own personal benefit like so many of the TV channels. I genuinely am trying to do this for everybody else's benefit, including my own, because I don't like what's going on either. So John Kenneth Galbraith calls bullying coercive power. He calls bribery compensatory power, and he calls brainwashing conditioned power. So bullying, bribery and brainwashing. And if you look through history, they are the use of violence, the use of money, and then the use of everything that Alvin Toffler was talking about in the third wave. Information dressed up as propaganda, or more accurately, propaganda dressed up as information. So those 3 power mechanisms we've got to be aware of. They're not helpful for anybody. You probably saw the pictures from Abu Ghraib. The person who is violating through violence and shaming a prisoner is herself or himself harmed in that relationship. And it's no wonder there's the amount of mental ill health around in unequal societies. And it's not just us who are worked, it's everybody else in society who are using all sorts of crazy survival strategies: drugs and alcohol, gambling, riotous sex and self-denial, the whole works, just to keep themselves to get through from one day to the next. Because as I say, in an unequal relationship like that, the person on top is being harmed, as is the person on the bottom. And the person on the top is fearful all the time that the person on the bottom is going to come back and start hitting them, or even switch to the dictatorship of the proletariat, as I mentioned. So we need to close these power relationships down. So that brings me to the 5 economic mechanisms. And if by now you've had enough and want to switch off, then you might be interested to know that an organisation in Canada called the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, that's CCPA, asked me to write these 5 articles, which they then put together in this Readings on Co-operative Socialism. And I could email you a PDF of this, and this has got essentially everything that I'm going to say from now onwards in it. So those 5 economic mechanisms that create economic inequality and generate income inequality are, and you've heard the first one, theft, that's why I give it the letter T, then rent, interest and profit, and then finally unequal pay for work. So I'm not quite sure whether that, by you viewing it, is TRIP, up, trip up, or whether I should hold my hand like that. but the acronym is still the same. That, to take for example the history of England, in 1066 William and the Norman bandits turned up on the south coast of England, and they said to Harold and the Wessex bandits, right, we are going to take all this country from you because it's a rich country which produces lots of money, and we want lots of money, and you're now out of the game. So there was a fight at a place called Battle, even if Tony Robinson's Time team has suggested that it isn't in the place in Battle where people thought it took place, but that's another story. And so Harold and the Wessex bandits, who incidentally had stolen the country from Knut and the Danish bandits, three lots of Vikings, the Danes, the Normans and the Anglo-Saxons under Harold, we ended up in 1066 with the Norman yoke. In other words, the Normans took over the country. They made an inventory of the country, eventually called the Domesday Book, and they worked out how much money the country should be paying them, how much they could extract. So the first form of theft is the theft of the land, and that provides rent. Now gradually, as those rents accumulated, the people who were accumulating money wanted the law changed so that they could charge interest on that money when they lent it out. So the theft of land produces rent, the theft of the law produces interest, which in those days, as equally now, is called usury. Financial usury, really equivalent to land usury, if you like, rent and interest. And that money got lent out, and in order to try and pay the money back along with the interest, all sorts of different groups, including a whole number of Quaker families, talk about them in just a minute, started to set up businesses which owned knowledge in the form of patents and know-how, and also frozen knowledge in the form of machinery, and they started to generate profits. So these three in the middle are the three forms of so-called unearned interest: rent from the ownership of land, interest from the ownership of the law, and profits, often distributed as dividends, from the ownership of knowledge. That's why the older socialists taught me the two phrases that you should get rid of capitalism, RID, rent, interest and dividends, or that our hope was that we could write capitalism, rest in peace, rent, interest, profits. So just to round this out, because I mentioned 5 economic mechanisms, the up part, unequal pay for work, is the income that 10% of the population of families get, higher than average incomes for doing paid work, and the thing that they have acquired or stolen or got a hold of, or call it what you will, is, I think, position. So, for example, the most senior people in the churches in medieval times, in the monasteries, had the higher incomes. They got the best cut of meat and so on and so forth at the table, and their position was at the top of a hierarchy. So in other words, although they didn't probably own the land, this is where William and the aristocracy were, they were one notch down, and they controlled the economic resources that the monasteries owned up until the dissolution of monasteries in Britain by Henry VIII. Strictly speaking, England and Wales, because we weren't united with Scotland at that time. So, if there are 5 economic mechanisms that create income inequality, the theft of land to give rent, the theft of the law to give interest, the theft of knowledge in workplaces to give profits, and the theft of position to give higher than average income for paid work, people that do the bullying, the bribery and the brainwashing, many of whose jobs start with the letter P, oddly enough. So you can make a list of prison governors and professors and publicists and politicians and so on and so forth. Those people are between the 2% and the 88% of us, the 2% who own economic resources, the 88% of us who are worked for a living, and most of that work is spirited away through bribery, bullying and brainwashing into the bank accounts of the owners of resources. So where does cooperative socialism come in all of this? Well, in a word, it comes in this little diagram here, which I should try and get as close as I can to the screen. And what this diagram is saying is that there really are 4 economic alternatives. The first of those is the one that we know about at the moment, and that's capitalism, of which there's 2 variants. Neoliberalism, where it's unregulated capitalism, there are no controls and there's a bonfire of red tape and all that stuff. Free trade between countries, and the World Trade Organization with their courts and lawyers would be able to sue the rest of us into penury. That's why the current work to stop the EU, Canada and EU, US so-called trade agreements is so important that it be stopped. The other variant of capitalism, which we now experience particularly in Canada, is neoconservatism, and ultimately neoconservatism shades away into a strictly managed economic system where the owners of economic resources are in league with the government, and that ultimately is fascism. And that's where we got to in Canada at the moment. The so-called conservative government is in effect just the political wing or arm of the chambers of commerce and other business institutions in Canada. And when they don't like what's going on in Parliament, they simply close it down. Just like Hitler burnt down the Reichstag, Stephen Harper, the Canadian Prime Minister, has twice closed down Parliament when he didn't think he was going to get the answer that he wanted. So, just like there are 2 forms of capitalism, the authoritarian form, neoconservatism, and the completely unworkable form of deregulated capitalism, which ultimately ends up in libertarian anarchism and violence, the circumstance, say, in Somalia, where there's no government and it's the people with the greatest number of guns and the biggest amount of money who tell everybody else what to do. On the other side of the diagram, we've got authoritarian not capitalism, which is what was going on in Russia before the Iron Curtain was taken down, and is going on in China at the moment with state-centred so-called communist capitalism. And then finally, down here in the southeastern quadrant of the map, here we've got a corner which is both progressive, so progressive here, and not hierarchical there, and I call that progressive non-hierarchical economic and social system cooperative socialism. So in other words, an equal society that looks like this, not one which is so mired in poverty that everybody's equal but starving, or equally a society that is mired in effluence up here, where everybody's producing so much pollution that the planet just can't cope. So a nice happy medium here, what us Quakers would call simplicity, matched with equality. And equality, as you'll notice from this, where everybody's different because genetically we are all different, although we can talk about that in a bit. So if there are 5 power mechanisms, what does cooperative socialism say about that? Well, if you want to look at the plan in detail, it's in here. It's also on the interestfreemoney.org website, the Campaign for Interest-Free Money in the Papers section. And the Cooperative Socialism plan, 7-point plan, is here. And what it basically says is, as far as theft is concerned, then we're not going to go down the route of nationalising economic resources like the Fabian Society suggested in this country, the UK, at the beginning of the 20th century, which was basically taking economic resources away from the inheritors of the Norman Conquest. We're not going to use old-fashioned words like stewardship, or even a word that was suggested to me recently, custodianship, but come up with a concept which I call cooperative careship. And by cooperative careship, I mean two things: the responsibility to care for those economic resources as best you can, so that's the sustainability point. And by cooperative, I mean an activity by individuals and groups of people that are consistent with this statement on the cooperative identity, which cooperators, people involved in the cooperative movement around the world, get together every 20 or 30 years and try and see if this statement is as good as it can be. And that's the up-to-date statement, which was published by the International Cooperative Alliance in 1995. It's a definition, values and principle statement. So if a group of people, or one person even, needs access to economic resources, land, knowledge, raw materials, energy and so on, they would sign some sort of time-limited, non-heritable, non-transferable contract to care for those resources as best they can with the community at large. And at the time that they finished using those resources to create wealth, and more on that in a minute, then those resources would go back to the community in as cared for a way as is conceivably possible within the limits of the laws of nature, and that means the laws of chemistry, and more of those in a minute. So workplaces then wouldn't be boss and worker workplaces, and that's the first point here on the plan. Not very easy to do this in mirror image fashion. And what I'm suggesting here is that there are basically two sorts of workplaces. One where there's a natural monopoly, so the provision of water, for example, in a city or a region, the provision of a postal service nationally, and so on and so forth, should be reasonably set up as what I call community cooperatives. So they are cooperative activities based on those cooperative values and principles, but not competing with another co-op. Not competing, there's a word, competing. So the rest of the workplaces where there isn't an obvious natural monopoly, the local coffee shops and publishers and so on and so on and so on, and I leave it to the community to decide where there is a natural monopoly and where there's not. They would probably be best run as truly worker cooperatives, where the workforce involved decide what to do and get on and try and be as creative as they can in the delivery of those goods and services to the community. And they would probably, but not necessarily, take some paid work income from that. I'll talk about that in just a bit. So that's the first 2 points in the plan. The second point specifically relates to a key element of wealth creation, and that's the working capital that you need, the money that you need to get set up. And I'm suggesting that, first of all, the banking and financial system should, first of all, be a not-for-profit activity, that it, because it's an economic activity within cooperative socialism, ought to be for social benefit rather than selfish benefit, and that it ought to be consistent with the cooperative values and principles that I've just mentioned. The second point about banking, and this is why there are 7 points when strictly speaking for a 5-point problem you only need 5 points. Somewhere down here, point 5, I'm talking about this mechanism of usury, of charging interest on lent money and created credit. So this is beyond the positive money conception around conversations around how money is created in the first place as interest-bearing debt. I'm talking here about how money is used even once it's been created as interest-bearing debt. And all of the faith traditions tell us that you shouldn't go around charging interest on lent money. Far better, in fact, in the Christian tradition, that you give money away rather than even lend it. And so money is so important that it's in here 3 times. The third one, which I just mentioned, is in the last 2. The last 2 deal with international affairs, and I'm saying here that if a country accumulates more money than it needs, then it ought to give it to countries that need some extra money in their economic system. This is a bit like John Maynard Keynes' notion of the Bancor, the international currency. Whether he talked about Bancor being lent at interest or given as a grant, I'm not sure. Other people will clarify that for me, I've no doubt. The other part of the international relationships is point 7. And the way I've written this, I'll just read it out. Well, point 7 is this point about capital grants, not loans. But point 6 is to do with regulating international financial flows. Now, at the moment, international flows have been deregulated. That's one of the first things that Margaret Thatcher's government did in 1979. They abolished exchange controls, and that's why we have this mayhem of money swizzling around the world, not even at the blink of an eye. This high velocity, high frequency trading that keeps on bringing the financial system to its knees. We need to control money and its flows and not allow it to do that. So finally, in all of this, what about the spirit level? Because if you remember the spirit level book, wherever it is here, probably under my feet, doesn't matter where it is, to be quite honest, because you saw the cover. How puzzling that I can't see it now. It doesn't matter. The spirit level book said that societies are more sustainable, they're happier, they're more peaceful, there's less crime, everybody's got more peace of mind when the income distribution is as narrowed as possible. So let's suppose that we set up the equivalent of a citizens' assembly for the country, or even within a borough, something called a fairness commission here in Bromley and in London generally, and that the people decide that a fair ratio would be 1 unit of income at the bottom to a maximum of 5 units of income at the top. Well, first of all, that bottom level there needs to be an absolute guarantee of income, and various names are given to this. I prefer the name living income for everybody, a life, citizens' income, a guaranteed livable income, a guaranteed annual income, a basic income, a base income, all sorts of names. But then in addition to this, if people want to go out into the workplace and get paid work income, then that would be a multiplier of this. So supposing that in this case this was equivalent to, shall we say, £1,000 a month as a guaranteed livable income, which I think is probably about half what it should be in the UK, then the paid work income would either be up to another 1,000 or another 2,000, 3,000 or 4,000. So somebody in paid work would be receiving a maximum, say, £5,000 a month, whilst those on a livable income will be receiving £1,000 a month. I actually think that that's way too big a distribution, but I'm not bully enough to tell the world how people should be paid. So, if that's what cooperative socialism is, a much more equal society, if not perfectly equal like that, certainly somewhere close to it, then how do we achieve it? And the editor of these articles headed up, I think, the third article with that headline. Parliament is where potential for change must be tapped. But he also added, but we all need to do something as well. As far as doing something is concerned, I guess you're doing the most helpful thing, certainly as far as I'm concerned, which is watching this video. And if this video ends up being watched by lots of folks, well, that would be just great. Part of that individual work is to get involved in political parties, and I'm a member of the Labour Party in Britain and also of the Co-operative Party in Britain, and when I lived in Canada I was a member of the New Democratic Party. It really doesn't make any difference to me which of the parties you get involved in, but if you just sit back on the sidelines and let it all happen, then it will go to hell in a handcart. You know, that saying that for evil to triumph, all that need happen is that good people do nothing. Of course, I would say that if you're supporting one of the parties like the Conservative Party or the Liberal Party that wants the continuation of capitalism, then you really are in a tricky place, because capitalism needs to go. It's unsustainable. It's immoral. It's based upon the values of theft, rape and murder, although Ed Finn, when he published these articles, didn't include that trio of theft, rape and murder, but I can justify those harsh terms if you like. So, over to you guys. I'm not quite sure how the next steps will happen, but we're inside 3/4 of an hour, and I think it's probably time for me to click the button. So again, I'm John Courtneidge. You can find me out there on the net, Facebook and such like. My family name is spelt Courtneidge, and here I am just trying to explain what cooperative socialism is all about, not on behalf of a political party or a pressure group or my own religious society of friends, the Quakers, but because Greta Doucette in Moncton, New Brunswick, said I should at least try. So at least I've tried. And if I can get this thing up on YouTube, you know what? I've even got some way further. Thanks a lot. Bye.